Um, there's a ton of stuff out there when you start thinking about network automation. And it can get pretty overwhelming. And it's nice to have some guide rails, some general thoughts to find for your direction, some general things to keep in mind as you're moving forward. And so we try to assemble some of these things, and it's amazing how difficult it actually is to consolidate all these different ideas down into just a few thoughts. And I know that Ken and myself, we could go on for days on several of these topics, so we're going to try not to do that for you. Keep it to a concise time frame here, but we wanted to give you just some guiding principles, some things to think about, and then, of course, we're always happy to spend more time, talk about specific use cases, during breaks, over lunch, in the evenings, and whatever too. So please always reach out to us, and for that matter, on Network to Code Slack channels, community, or on Twitter, wherever that is, we're always happy to talk and debate these ideas further. So, what do most people do when they decide, hey, I'm gonna start on a network automation project? You go pick up your favorite tool of the week and you start trying to write some automation, right? I challenge you to back up, not just a step, back up about 3 steps, and ask yourself why you're automating, what you're automating. Who is going to interact with that? Are you automating something that you do every day so that you can do it faster? Or are you trying to automate something so that those people that keep coming to you with requests, these very common requests, so that they can actually have some self-service access to something? Because you should approach those a little bit differently. Because if you think about the perspectives, the knowledge that the people have coming into that, they're going to be different. If you're writing something for yourself, who knows? Maybe it's very very simple. There's not as many guardrails. There's not quite as many. Maybe the interface isn't quite as pretty. Maybe you have a little bit more freedom in that tool because you already know exactly what you're doing, what you need. You just need to get it done faster. And that's fine. But if you're trying to hand that off to somebody else, somebody that's in another part of your business, they might not understand all the things that you do about the network. They're going to need more guardrails, more guidance, more help along the way, and most importantly, they probably need things phrased differently. I don't know how many of you have people that come to them or come to you and say, I need a new BGP neighbor set up. I need a new VLAN for this. I need a new QoS policy. Most of the time, people are coming to you with a higher level request. I've got a printer that I need plugged in somewhere and it needs to work. So think about the terminology that they use and meet them there. Make your automation meet them. So understand why you're automating and what you're automating.
Yeah, kick off here as well. This is just a little preface before I can kind of get the slides. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a principal at Network to Code as well as Jere here. Got started in IT back in 2000. Was kind of always joined the Air Force. Was always kind of the scripter there, so kind of developed my career going as a network engineer traditionally, always the guy kind of to the side, doing some scripting. About 3 years ago, I started with Network to Code, and just been kind of automating, automating full time ever since. And then specifically about this slide, I'm not using this in the snarky, we're not using this in the snarky layer 8 like political games type view of it. It's not meant to be that political trope. We're really understanding the business side of what you're asking for, right? And I have this theory that most developers kind of fall into one of two categories. One is someone who reads documentation very well, and they can understand immediately. And the other is someone who learns by examples. Now, I'm an example person, so I apologize if there's a lot of kind of examples that are throughout here, but it helps me to reframe things as an example. But when you define things in business terms, it really changes and reframes your mind as how things are going. So a common request for many of our customers would be, I'll ask them, what are you trying to do here? What is it? And the answer will be, configure BGP, add a VLAN. But that doesn't really explain what it is you're going to do. Often it's at capacity. Now, at capacity in a data center doesn't necessarily define everything for you, right? Because that can mean IP space, add VLANs, new physical switches, new uplinks, etc. But it helps reframe what your actual agenda is. What are you trying to get through? It defines the why. The business side defines the why. The technical side defines the how. As engineers, we get caught up so much into the how, and we're always, but generally speaking, if you went more towards the why, you're never going to go too much far. Like we're all engineers at heart, and we're not going to get that far down that path that we can't look back. But understanding the business side of it actually helps frame it back to the business. What is the value you have here? What is it that you're trying to do? What makes the business move, essentially? So, and another example too is to use the technology to solve problems, right? Not have the technology be the problem solver. So again, I'll probably better state that as an example. So the question kind of came up of what's the best container orchestration, or what's the best way to deploy this application in the container? And the question always comes back to what is it you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to build a highly scalable containerized application, then by all means use best practices, okay? But if you're just trying to use this as a mechanism to develop and have the same environment across, well, you don't have to have a separate DB container. You don't have to have a separate, every layer kind of separate out containers. It just adds complexity for no value. So best practice, I would never tell you to go away from best practice, but just always understand what it is you're trying to do, and then let the best practices come out from there, not the other way around. Don't let best practices force you into complicated designs. So the easy bit, we talk about oftentimes configurations. Network automation is very much associated with configuration, right, and deploying configuration. But in reality, it's a very hard thing to get started with, right? Actually deploying configurations is tough because it has to be right. As we heard before, going through all of the all those various samples that can happen, or examples, sorry, that can happen. It's tough to get through, and it's tough to get it right the first time. So we often see a lot more movement in worrying about pre and post change, as an example, operational validation, rather than actually pushing configurations, right? And you don't want network automation to be blamed. If you're worrying about configuration deployment at first, and it goes afoul, which it will, network automation gets blamed. If you let the configuration management take a back seat, there's a lot of other things that can be done that's kind of more important. And it's kind of the fun stuff too, right? The configuration of it is kind of the fun stuff. So kind of getting rid of all that other process. How do you get approvals to kind of be automated? How do you get getting XIP, all those other different integrations? Those actually take a lot more time than the actual you banging away at the CLI. So there's a lot of other things that go into it. And it's kind of step on a little bit, and we'll talk about workflow here. But it's very much the same thing as that. How do you, don't worry about, it's not to say don't worry about apologies, but it's not the only thing to worry about. There's a lot of other things to kind of consider, and to take those to the forefront and understand what is your best path forward. How do you move from not automating to fully automating?
So once you've asked some questions, figuring out what you're doing, why you're doing it, who you're helping, then you need to measure what you have right now. Another key that we see, people jump into building things. in the end, did you make things better? Or do you now just have another set of tools to do what you were doing before? Is it easier to use? Do you get things through to your end users faster? And I don't even necessarily mean the next team up from you or the next team up from you, but when you think about it, somebody has an idea that they're trying to get into production somewhere to be able to either save money or make money for your company. Now, that needs potentially servers, VMs, network changes. It could be a whole host of things. So think about that end-to-end process, but measure. So with the current process, how long does it take from somebody requesting this thing to happen, for it to go all the way through everything that has to be done, for it to be completed for them to use? Now, often what happens is when you look at that, actually configuring the device, 5, 10 minutes. And then you've got a bunch of pre-checks and post-checks. Those actually take quite a bit of time, or they can. If you're doing them really well, they can take quite a bit of time, especially for you to then go back and compare all the things you need to be comparing in there. As Ken mentioned, you've got all your data lookups. You've got just managing your tickets and the whole workflow there, getting your approvals, all of that. When you look at it, when you actually measure the amount of time that it takes to make a change, the change itself is usually a fairly small piece of that. But that's the part where we start automating most often. Maybe we should look at that end-to-end process and go, I spend 3/4 of my time just dealing with my change ticketing system and copying data from one tool into another, and from here over to there, and maybe making this one tweak along the way. What if we automate that first? If we automate that first, now you've actually not only sped up the process, you've reduced some of the risk, you've also potentially made your life a little bit better. I don't know how many people here got into networking to spend most of their time in a change management system and to write, change policies and all those good things and wait on review boards. I didn't. I got in to actually do the networking. So if we can speed up some of these other things that just don't really add value to your day, but have to be done, then you get to actually focus on networking. And I don't know anybody in the networking world that doesn't have a laundry list behind them of things that they'd like to do on the network. You just don't have time because you're stuck in all this process. So maybe that's something that we can do to keep things moving forward.
So this slide's it's titled System of Record. I purposely didn't call it Source of Truth. And if you ever spend more than 5 minutes with me, I'll probably use the word Source of Truth within those 5 minutes. But I want to kind of delineate between having this monolithic, one single app, this pie in the sky, CMDB, Source of Truth, whatever it is. It's just not realistic. So I tend to talk about instead is system of record, right? So if you can keep within compliance of this idea of, for a single system of record, there's a single source of truth, then I think that really tells a different story, right? One of the questions I ask all my customers is, as they're trying to build this giant CDB, this single monolithic application, use Ensign, NetBox, whatever the case may be, I say, who owns the site codes, right? Which group owns the site codes? Inevitably, it's the business, right? And you don't get to tell the business what's going to change. If they use Salesforce, that's it. That is the source of truth. That's the system of record. Now, as they change site codes, which for whatever reason people change companies change site codes all the time, you simply have to reflect that change. You can't go back to the business and say, hey, well, we have it in NetBox as NYC. You change it to NYX. It doesn't happen, right? So really been kind of going through this idea of kind of aggregating your system of records into a single view, right? So if you can get everything down to a single view, but you have an understanding of where the system of record is per data point, it really changes things. And what you should do instead of trying to force everything to be one place and then copying over, is have one aggregated place to reflect all the various different system of records, right? So if you have a spreadsheet for VLANs and that works for you, that's fine, integrate with that spreadsheet. If you have Salesforce for building codes, integrate with it. Try to reflect it from one view within the network, not the other way around. Don't try to constantly copy over. Have an automated method to move that data into it so that you're not concerned about it. And then, the accessibility, that's crucial, right? If you get to this point beyond, configuration management, the hard part is definitely the data. I talk about this all the time. If you could say if you understood your intended state versus the actual state of the device, and there's kind of big delineation, like the actual state of the device is whatever the device is, right? Whatever the operational configuration commands of the device show, that's the actual state. For most people, the intended state is thus that. It'd be awesome to separate them. It'd be even better to have them in sync. So your intended state is always reflected, or the actual state is always reflected from the intended state. So intended state out to device. But if you can get to that point, that's crucial. It's a much harder problem to solve than kind of ginger templating or kind of building data structures out of the existing CLI models. It's a much harder problem. Understand the quality of the device, of the data. So understanding how do you ensure that the data is accurate, right? Without looking at every piece of the hundreds, thousands, or millions of records that are out there. Put in some schema controls on things, such as regex matching on hosting, or ensuring an IP address is a valid IP address. But these are all things that just kind of goes through like code smells of understanding where there's a problem, where there's not. And the last thing we'll kind of talk about is this idea of how do you have your data live in purgatory so that your intended state is in purgatory until you're ready for your change. So I'll give kind of a classic example. You're going to implement a firewall change on, all firewall changes happen on Friday at midnight, right? And so you change your database, you change your Git repository to reflect this. Now, if you do that now, then and run through all of your tests and everything else, if you're really far down the path of network automation, if you do that now and have all that working, you have this gap there, right? So you constantly have this problem of my intended state is actually what I want it to be after this change, and then you have these changes kind of stacked on top of each other. You have no way to kind of separate them. So one of the great things that Git does is kind of let data live in like purgatory, right? And there's this kind of balance you have between databases, which are great for storing data, kind of accessing data, really analytics, and then Git, which is great for integrations with CI and kind of testing data, and letting it live to sit there and say, I will only merge this change when it's change time. Otherwise, if you make a change in, let's say, a netbox and say you change an IP address of an interface, you either have to do it at the moment of the change, or it gets out of sync, which is just a fundamentally hard problem to deal with. And it's really understanding the balance between these various different systems. And there is no, as in life, there's no silver bullet answer. There's no one, correct monolithic answer. It's your journey. It's understanding the pathway forward. Yes, sorry. Please.
So the problem about not tapping into the system of record is certainly one I think that we all face every day. And oftentimes it's just because we're not ever going to get access to it, right? Yeah, they're happy to send us a spreadsheet, right? Any strategies as you work through so many different clients on how to approach that?
And just for case you couldn't hear, the question is dealing with the original system of records. They're obviously owned by different organizations that you don't directly have control concerning any strategies. And fundamentally, I'll say two things. One is case-by-case basis, right? So that there's no silver bullet. And the second is how do you make the user experience the best to fit that need? Meaning, how do you make it easier for that team to kind of integrate with, right? So kind of going back to the API programmability aspect of it, how do you make the interface you want to basically align incentives so that, and user experience so that it's the best for them to kind of want to deal with it, right? So if you can eliminate emails going through, right? So it's like, hey, you update this spreadsheet, if you put it on the SharePoint directory, you put it in the shared directory, we will pull it down every night and we'll change it, and you don't have to deal with it. You're never gonna have to hear us complaining that you're not, so it's just having a strategy, and I'm always big on aligning incentives, right? It's just, how do you get them to want to do the same thing as you? I think that's the strategy.
Yeah, I think having some very candid and gentle conversations with those data owners can be key. Sitting down, you don't need 47 people in that meeting. Get 2 or 3 people in there, sit down with them and say, look, this is our goal. And in order to build a decent automation system, you have to have accurate quality data. Otherwise, you're just automating a mess. And anytime you're exporting data from one thing and making a copy of it somewhere else, you now are out of sync. And your environment is going to be different than the next. And even one data set different from the next. So you have to have those discussions. How often does this change? What are the risks associated with us being out of sync for some period of time? That right there, that alone can be incentive for them to say, no, you're right. Maybe we need to figure out how to safely get you direct access to the original data. I also work with teams a lot in a gradual process. I think we've all done this to say, okay, we would love rewrite, full access to this data. But tell you what, why don't you give us just read access for right now? Let's start building some things. Let's prove that we can be responsible with that, because they're uncomfortable. They don't know the tooling we're using necessarily, coming in and interacting with their data. Make sure we can be responsible with that. Then we'll gradually get to, okay, you can read data and you can update certain fields. And then eventually maybe they say, okay, you can just have, read, write, and add and delete, all of that together. So just work through that as a process. The next thing really is your standards. So you've asked what you're automating. You've done some measurements about where you're starting. And you've got good quality data. Now what about your standards? Because really when it comes down to it, the configuration that you apply is a combination of your data and your standards. Now, if you want to take this to a really technical discussion really quickly, you can encode your standards in something like a Jinja templating environment. And that could be your standard. Your Jinja templates are your standard. And your data could be in YAML or JSON or in your databases, wherever that happens to reside. But as you populate those templates with your data, you get a configuration. And whenever you put the same data in to the same template, you will always get the same config. That is your set of standards. Now, not everybody's ready to go that full distance. Sometimes you take some smaller steps. You take a config that meets your agreed upon standards, and you can break off chunks. And so maybe you just template out parts of that at a time. The rest can remain text, like people are used to seeing it. And all that can be combined together to create the config on the device. And then you can gradually start codifying more and more pieces of that config until you have most or the whole taken care of. But don't think that you have to turn every last line into some form of code either. Take a gradual approach to it and look at what changes. I mean, how often do we change our NTP standards? You might change your NTP servers on occasion. A new data center spins up. You deploy something in a new region. But how often do you change the general way you configure that feature or the next feature? So there are a lot of things that really are fine to remain straight configuration text. But once you've settled on these standards, you have to adhere to them. When you're writing automation, I think we can all say that when you have multiple standards deployed in your environment, and most people do, it's nothing wrong with you, it's the state of life. You can write automation or try to write automation that will be able to understand all of those different standards and try and be able to manage them. But you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. The other option is you choose a standard, or maybe a standard and one or two revisions back, and you say, we're going to be able to manage these standards with automation. Anything that doesn't meet those standards, then the choice is to bring them up to a current standard that is manageable by the automation. And you're going to save a lot of time. You're going to save a lot of pain. I think most of us have tried at one point to write something that'll do everything, and it's not impossible, but it hurts. But you take those standards, turn them into some sort of code, whether it's in what you wrote, as far as your tooling, whether it's Python or something, whether it's a templating system like Jinja, turn that into some sort of code. Now you can revision control that in like your software systems like GitHub or wherever you store your code, and that way it's easy to go back. You can go back in time, see what was the standard 6 months ago. You can see all of that very clearly, and that really helps moving forward. Then the next thing we have to do is we have to test. Now, testing is a topic I personally could go on about for days. But the short of it is, we all know that we have a test environment. Some of us are lucky enough to have a separate environment that we call production. But you need to make sure that you're testing somewhere. Vendors are getting so much better these days about giving us virtual devices. Do they handle everything that the physical devices do? No, but they're getting better and better. And we can keep driving the vendors to make those virtual images better. Because when you can deploy a copy of your network in the cloud, test the configurations, test the results of that before you go and deploy in production, you've given yourself a much, much better assurance that you're going to get the end results out of what you're doing that you meant to. But even backing up before we get to devices, from the software development world, there's so many different things that we can test. And each of these things, they're kind of broken down into some common areas. And the breadth of what they cover grows as you go down this chain. So looking at style and linting, what do those mean? Those mean things like, so linting is making sure that something can parse, making sure that the tools can read what you gave it. I can't overstate how many issues you can find in code just by making sure that it parses correctly before you try to run it. Same thing with style. You might think, oh gosh, some tool is complaining about why I put, one blank line rather than two blank lines in between these things, or why I used, this kind of quote or that kind of quote. But unless you are the only person that's ever going to manage that, pick a style, whatever that style is, or pick a tool that enforces a style and go with it. Make sure you go with that consistently, because otherwise, somebody else is going to come in to look at your code to try and add something or fix something, make something better, and they're going to struggle to figure that out. Or what I find is almost worse is 2 years later you come back to your code and you're trying to figure out, what did I do? So these things, typically style and length checkers, run in seconds. There's no excuse for not having those run every time you write something new. Unit tests. Now translating that to our world, in the software world, that's testing a function in code. We're not necessarily writing functions per se, but think about the smallest discrete piece of whatever you're automating that you can try out, make sure it works, and understand whether that's been successful or not. Moving up from there is functional. For us, that's more features. Features like when you're writing good Agile user stories, if you're familiar with that concept. As a user, I expect when I ask this thing to do something, that this is what comes out of it. So think about it from that perspective. Test in these small pieces, because when you test in the small chunks, and each of the individual small chunks works, you've got a really great likelihood of the whole working in the end. Now, each of these takes just a little bit longer to run, but when you automate them, and there's some great tooling out there to help with that, then it just becomes just a thing that happens every time you write code, and it becomes a habit. Integration tests. These are when you start looking at, well, how does this thing that I'm doing interact with something else? So how does it interact with that database? How does it interact with ServiceNow, things like that? And so integration tests are usually very, very point focused. And before you've actually done your full-on integration tests, there's even a concept called mocking and stubbing. Sounds crazy, but the idea is you can actually provide in a test framework the ability to say when this system that we're testing makes this call out to ask something else for some piece of data or some piece of information, or tries to send something somewhere, instead of actually talking to that real thing, I know that whenever that request comes out, that there's a certain response that's supposed to come back. Why don't we just fake that response within the test framework and send it right back to the system? So now you don't have to worry about, well, did my test actually change something in real ServiceNow or in the database? No, you're testing that those interactions do go out right, and that the system behaves correctly when it gets a response back. The cool thing there is you can also send bad responses back. So you can make sure that your error checking works. You can say, well, instead of me getting the 200 OK back from that HTTP call, I got a 403, I got a 503, I got a 900. What in the world's a 900? But your system shouldn't just blow up then. It should, you want things to throw a decent error that says, hey, I got something, I don't know what this is, but a human needs to look at this, right? You don't just want to just blindly accept and go, oh, well, I got something back, let me go continue on. Then when you get to your systems integration, now you're really looking end to end. is the code that you're working with, your automation tooling, does it really work with virtual or real devices and your source of record and your change management system and your TACACs and your all of the different pieces that you might be interacting with, and your Slack, whatever those different pieces are. So these system tests can even be automated in a number of ways. But you've got to have this mindset of testing from the beginning, because adding these tests in later, it gets hard, and you're like, well, it's working, do I really need to go write those? Trust me, when you're the one coming back to this code 2 years later, and you're like, I just want to make this one change, it's no big deal, it'll be fine. And then you, roll that out in production and go, oh, wait, that was a typo, that's not quite fine. Or worse, as Ken mentioned, as Darren was mentioning, it's not a typo. It's actually a valid command that you sent out. It's just the wrong command. It didn't do what you meant for it to do. You need to be able to look for those things. And to think about things like, how do you test those? How do you know whether something's right or not? Most of us have when we make a change manually, you know in the back of your mind, well, here's the set of commands I need to run to see whether that worked. And seeing whether that was successfully configured is just one step. Seeing whether that actually went into operation is another. So I added another BGP peer. That's great. It's in the config. But if that peer doesn't show as up and communicating with me, that's not doing me much good, is it? And then the next step, did I actually get the routes I was expecting through that path? So need to think through all those things that you would manually check, and you can add those in to your tests. Not just your tests on your production code, but your test system here too. If you're giving this out to other people to use, if you're not the end user, if you're handing it to somebody else, think about some user acceptance testing. Get just enough of your system working that somebody can kind of poke at it and play with it a little bit, and then give it to them. And see if they have that really squirrely, confused look on their face, like, I have no idea what you just handed me, or what's supposed to go into it. Or if they look at it and go, oh yeah, I kind of get this. And ask them questions. Listen carefully to the questions that they ask along the way through that, because those are areas that you can kind of smooth that process out to make that easier for them to use. And you can get into, there are all kinds of other crazy things. Canary deployments are they're really fun, but they're a more complex idea of, I have a bunch of users, but I'm gonna roll this out in production, but only to a few users that I know are more accepting of potential issues as we're trying this out the first time and things. And then you gradually roll that out to everybody. Performance. This is a big one. I mean, this is performance testing in an automated way. It can be really hard. Now, what are you doing? Are you interacting with Ixias and Spirents and other things like that in your system too? Think about that. It's entirely possible. There are ways to get all these things in. And then regression testing. Having been a test engineer for a long time, I'm huge on regression testing. If you build all these tests from the ground up, from the start, you're gonna have a great base. You're not gonna build all these at once, but you're gonna have a great base. But then when you do hit issues, write a new test. If something breaks one day, go write a test to search for that. So that the next time, when you go change the code, that test is going to stop you from pushing that code out until you've handled that particular situation. Testing is huge. There's so many different types of tooling around, but focus on why you're testing and focus on what units you're testing, and then you can pick the right pieces and parts to help you along that path.
Just two things to add to that. With the testing, it's often hard to quantify what testing is giving you. So it's often hard to justify to the business because you're essentially saying it's what didn't happen, right? You stop yourself from making mistakes. I think it's really important as an industry for us to really consider this and put this at the forefront. Very few of our customers actually do appreciate that, but it's fundamentally important. And the other thing was just get started. If you never get beyond linting, that's fine. But if you have that process in there, to add one test to the existing testing framework is so much easier than just getting that first. So if you just always started with linting and then you build on whatever else after there, that's a huge, huge win. Yes.
So both the standards and testing that you guys just went over, so we got to build all this ourselves. Is there already libraries of tests out there, or libraries of standards that we can pull in so that we're not starting from ground zero? Reinventing it every time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a tricky thing. So that's just looking at which piece and part you're testing. So when you're looking at things like style and linting, most of that's already written. You just have to pick a tool and go use it. So if you're writing information in YAML, you can go pick one of the tools that checks YAML files, that knows what YAML should look like, and will tell you when you've got an extra space in there or not enough spaces or whatever that is, right? So many of those do exist. Eventually, you do get to some areas that are very specific to your environment. But along with testing, testing kind of connects to compliance too. And there's some interesting tools out there that are available for that piece. Things that go through and look at some of the NIST recommendations and have implemented those in different ways, so that you can basically scan your environments and see how close they are to conforming with those NIST standards and such. So even from just pure capabilities, some of the like Spire and Nixia tools can even test your network to see if it's handling all of the particular options for some feature that you're using correctly or not. So.
Okay, so selecting technology. This is deal with this all the time with customers. Become far too tool-centric in my opinion. It's just is this the right tool? Is this the wrong tool? And the one thing we say is there's no right tool, but there are definitely plenty of wrong ones, right? That's kind of when you work with a tool and the UX is not good, it's buggy, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very much in use case specific, right? And so oftentimes we'll kind of walk into to a different enterprise and kind of have to really understand what their business is and what their use cases are to understand it if it is the right way, or if there are better tools. And honestly, I would never tell anyone to just kind of wholesale start changing out tools. Just kind of pick them apart one at a time, get that one integrated, and just a lot of overhead kind of tools. It ultimately, to me, is really asking the wrong question. It goes back to what is your business trying to do here? And does this tool solve it, yes or no? And does it solve part of it? Can we live without it, right? But this tool-centric world, I don't think is going to be. It's not going to solve. It's not going to solve everything. And there's so many different pieces, and every tool will have overlap with the next tool, et cetera, et cetera. And the other question we hear all the time is build versus buy. And a lot of this, do you invest into your own internal resources? And what is your skill set? And this is fundamentally it's going to come down. It's going to be different for each company, each enterprise. But there's again no silver bullet answer, and each have to you have to tackle each one individually. So, kind of this same vein, the speed and scale. We hear this all the time, which is equating how fast something works to being how good a tool is, and it's really very much to me falls into the category of premature optimization. Worrying about scale right at the beginning is generally a fool's errand, right? If you can't get to work, if you can't get adoption, if you can't worry about user experience and everything else, you'll never get off the ground anyway. And yes, it's great to have, to build in proper best practices and methodologies to scale from the ground up, but it does come at a cost, right? All that, traditionally you call it waterfall type, building for that in platform only, it just comes at a cost. So, if it's simple and easy, just add celery or something to your architecture, that's great. But realistically, it's not been what we've seen that's kind of doing it. Really, when you get to that problem, that's solve the problem. But worrying about all this up front is just it's just very resource intensive. And generally speaking, you see these great platforms kind of you built on these great platforms, the adoption never takes off. So how did that help? How did that work out? And I would say, if you could just press a button, and it took 24 hours, but your network was always configured every time you press that button, is that an acceptable solution? And it may not be, but a lot of times it is. If you think of like a CDN, where someone's worried about like bandwidth kind of changing at the microsecond, well, speed's very important, right? And if your application may scale out, okay, then that's very important. But again, it's use case specific, especially seen in the enterprise world. As people are moved by speed scale, as you drill down to use cases, we just generally don't see it as much. It's not to say it doesn't exist, because it certainly exists, but it's just lower on the scale in terms of the priorities. Okay, that's probably my favorite slide. So taxonomy, kind of talking about all the different, literally the actual principles of network automation, or I should say of development. Fundamentally, what I realized is there has to be agreement on taxonomy to be able to communicate to each other, overstaying the obvious, I guess. But having these in mind as you start developing your network automation really helps frame things in a much better manner. Like, thinking about this as think about this. We'll allow you to program differently, automate differently. So I'll kind of go through this. Probably my slide will talk through line by line. But so imperative is stating the actual steps you're going to do something in, right? So this example says, go to the store, buy milk, come home, right? You're just sitting there saying step by step how you want to do it. This is generally speaking how you would start, right? Just kind of how your workflow, how your mind works, kind of a weird way. Declarative is defining the state, right? So make sure we have enough milk for breakfast, right? You're not defining the steps themselves. You're just defining the outcome, right? It's just a different way of programming. And if you guys look in the slide notes that should be posted, we kind of have more verbiage and kind of like functions associated with it. Wouldn't say it should make sense. Okay, I didn't put it. So this is the idea of checking the state before modifying the state, right? So if you're going to deploy a VLAN item locally, you can run it one times or n times, right? X times, however you want to say it, and you will only actually push configuration one time, right? Or maximum one time. So if you said yourself, I want VLAN 10 here, the first time you ran it, it would configure VLAN 10. Great. Next time you ran it, it would say, oh, VLAN 10's there. Nothing happens, right? And it's really powerful because it allows you to constantly redeploy your whatever configuration, whatever the state is, whatever you're trying to do. And it really limits your surface area of potential problems, right? If you're constantly adding configurations and so forth, and if you're scared to run that playbook because it's going to add something each time, that fundamentally becomes a problem. You don't want to run that, or I should say, if you're running a scripted process, whatever it is, you don't want to do that. Okay. Dry and wet. So do not repeat yourself. Write everything twice. Right. So basically saying, big functions out of your code. Don't keep going. Don't keep copy pasting. Like if you find yourself copying from one function to the other in the same program, abstract it. Keep it dry. Atomic. So Don't pour the glass full if you can't drink it all at once. So basically saying, like, if I'm going to change the configuration, I'm going to end up in one of two states. No configuration change or everything changed. Nothing in between. Because that's often the worst part of it. It's this half area which you cannot possibly understand all of the different permutations within there. So you really, it's pretty powerful. Principle of least astonishment. Principle of least astonishment. Don't put OJ in your milk carton. This really kind of goes into, like, if you had a function called one or none, and it returned 2 every now and then, you're not expecting that, right? You're not expecting this other use case. So it really kind of describes to whoever else is coming in and looking at your code afterwards what you're doing, right? So it helps with that piece of it. Robustness principle. So this is the idea of open in what you accept and strict in what you do. So as an example, you might say, I have a function that will accept an integer or a string that's an integer, right? But when I go to talk to someone else, I'm only going to send an integer, right? So you kind of want to presume the worst for your neighbor, and you want to be the best citizen as you're interacting with other systems and integration points, and so forth. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a lot, and as you kind of understand each one of these, it will reframe the way you automate your program, and it's a great way to just nomenclature is important. Agreeing on terminology is important, and allows you to shorthand a lot of conversations. So, the valuable bit, right? So we talked about the easy bit, the valuable bit. A lot of times you're just literally automating, like I said, the fun stuff away. Just configuration. No one really cares about all these various data integration points. Go into IPAM, updating it in a subnet. It doesn't get done, right? Approval processes, emails. I've sat with many customers, and they've said to me, you can't save me time because my time is spent in emails and meetings. And as we drill down into it, no, there is. If we could have a systematic way to generate emails, there wouldn't be meetings. And if we could have, if we could import from emails and kind of give consolidated reports, we could get rid of emails, right? So you're not going to solve everything, but you can chip away at this process. Ticketing, inventories, compliance reporting, everything else. Just a quick anecdote. Had a customer explain to me that they had a large ZTP problem. And as we went on site, kind of over 2 days, as we went through the process of all the various different data sources, all the various different approvals, workflows, et cetera, we finally got to the person who was deploying the configuration. And we said to him, so how long does it take? We understand it's a large ZTP problem. Or ZTP would solve a large problem. At the end of the day, he goes, it's about 20 minutes of my day, but it's like a week and a half long process. I think it was like 60 hours or something like that, of work to get to that point in 20 minutes, right? And it didn't fundamentally understand their own problem, or I should say, management didn't necessarily understand the problem until that point. But it's really, all that other stuff that happens before the configuration management is so much more important. Describing your workflow and going through all that is just, it saves you much more time than the actual, let's call it configuration management piece.
So once you've gone through all these other steps, now it's time to measure again. Take the things that you looked at. Look at that workflow. All those things that take time in the process. Now you started automating. Take the time again to go measure those one more time. Because now you have some really powerful information to take back to your business, to take to your management, your leadership, and say, hey, we didn't just automate doing this thing, this abstract thing, that's concrete to you, but abstract to them. But when you can come back and say, we can now deploy this much faster. We can do this many more of these upgrades in a weekend. We can actually turn around a request to our business partners faster, which means that they can get their applications rolled out into production quicker, which means the business can start making money faster. That is something that your leadership understands. So really, focus on that, because that is what your leadership understands. That's what they value. When you can turn it into time or turn it into dollars, they get that. So you've probably heard a lot about Agile over the last few years too. Don't think that it's a bunch of crazy stuff and it's just one of many ways of going about things. But the general idea is break things into chunks. Break things into small pieces, focus on one thing at a time. Don't try to boil the ocean. Say, I'm going to get just enough of this working that I can demonstrate it doing something successfully. Now you can show that to somebody. You can get other people on board with what you're doing. You can get other people involved. You can be a champion. You can build other champions to go encourage other people to be accepting of this and to be a part of this. Then gradually pick off one improvement at a time and make one thing better on it. Add one more feature, make it talk to one more thing, another integration. Make this one manual field actually go retrieve something from a data, go do a lookup in the database. Pick one thing at a time, get those things done, get them working, get them rolled out. And there's all these guiding principles, like the two pizza rule is pretty funny. But the idea is that how many times have you been in a productive meeting that had more people than could consume 2 pizzas? Right? If you have more people than that, it's time to start breaking things up, and that goes for meetings, that goes for development teams, whatever that is. So there's a lot of great ideas, but think about it as breaking things down into small chunks and getting them done. So in summary, measure. Think about your workflows. Think about your business. Think about how to test what you've done. Make sure it's a good experience for the people that are using it, whoever that is. Measure again and show that improvement. Show that value to your business. Show that to your leadership. And demonstrate how this can all make all of our lives a little bit better. Thank you.